Hello, my name is Sandy Adomaitis, the social media director for the Page International Screenwriting Awards, and your host for The Writers Hangout, a podcast that celebrates the many stages of writing, from inspiration to the first draft, revising, getting a project made, and everything in between. We'll talk to the best and the brightest in the entertainment industry and create a space where you can hang out, learn from the pros, and have fun. Welcome to the Writers Hangout. Thanks for listening. The coffee of choice we're drinking is the Pure Vita Blend from Silver Lake's Cafe Cito. It has notes of chocolate, brown sugar, and berries. Great aroma and great taste. Today, we're talking with Victoria Lucas, an independent producer who has developed scripts for projects starring Antonio Banderas, Scarlett Johansson, Wesley Snipes, and Hilary Swank. Among her favorite projects is the highly acclaimed coming-of-age film, The Island on Bird Street, which was awarded the Silver Bear at the Berlin International Film Festival. Victoria is also a judge for the Page Awards contest, and her family has worked in Hollywood since the very earliest days of the film industry. We're going to talk with her about her legendary grandmother, Bess Meredyth, who is also a screenwriter, actress, and a founding member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Let's start the show. Victoria, thank you for joining us at the Writers Hangout. Now, you come from a legendary Hollywood family, and well, we're here to talk about your grandmother, Bess Meredyth. Can you share with us the other famous people in your family?
Well, my grandfather was Michael Curtiz. Everybody in the world says Curtiz, but he said Curtiz, so we all said Curtiz.
Good.
He directed movies like, well, the biggest movie I guess everybody knows is Casablanca.
Ugh.
He also did movies like Yankee Doodle Dandy, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Mildred Pierce. I think he did like 90 pictures. So he did an
Mildred
awful lot
Pierce?
of films.
Oh my
He
goodness. I love that movie.
Well, he liked it too. He worked with Joan Crawford twice in Mildred Pierce and then later on in Flamingo Road. And they got along very, very well.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Mother was an actress and father was a writer, producer, director, mostly in television towards the end of his career, but he started in features.
He wrote on some classic TV shows. Can you name one?
He did. He wrote, produced, and directed many of the episodes of the original Star Trek. He also did Mannix and The Fugitive and some Fantasy Islands and all sorts of Ben Casey. A lot of the 60s and 70s series.
Oh my goodness, those are just the best, iconic old-time TV shows. How wonderful. I was going to share with our audience a little bit of a background about your grandmother and then was going to ask a couple questions. Is that good with you?
That sounds wonderful.
Great. And also, please jump in because I'm just dying to hear anything you have to say about your grandmother. I am obsessed with her. I admire her. And I just think she's amazing. Okay.
She was a pretty amazing lady.
Now, Bess Meredyth was born on February 12th, 1980 in Buffalo, New York.
1890.
1890? Oh, my bad. Sorry. You might have to help me pronounce this. Her original name was Helen Elizabeth McGlash.
Yes. And her father was a theater manager, and she started out doing vaudeville. She was very, very talented musician, pianist, and she did what they call piano duologues, which is telling a story and punctuating it with music, with sort of filling it in like a musical score to the story, which she wrote herself. And you don't hear that anymore. People don't do that, but back in the vaudeville circuit, that was one of the things that they did.
Yes, and to be a vaudeville comedian, it just, you have to be on it. You have to be really good. And that couldn't have been an easy crowd to hang out with. You probably grew up a little fast.
She probably did grow up fast, but she could handle herself. I mean, she once walked into, she was, I think, 13 years old, and she'd won this newspaper competition for a short story. And she marched into the editor's office and she said, "I won the competition. I'll write you a column a week, and I want $1 every column." And he was so shocked, he said yes. So that was her first writing job.
Wow, that is amazing. She headed to Hollywood, would you say 1911?
I think it was around that time, yes.
Okay, and she began work as an extra?
Yes, she met her husband, who actually my biological grandfather, who was a director there, and he convinced her that she ought to give what they called the flickers a try, and she was not sure. I mean, this was a very, very new business, and nobody knew whether it was going to be real or not, and she was going to give up her vaudeville career, and she finally said, "Yeah, I'll give it a try." And so she started work as an extra and very quickly realized that if she wanted a role, she better write them, which is something that we see even now. And she started writing herself little serials, like 1 and 2 reel comedy adventures. And she called it Bess the Detectress. And she played a Bessie Pinkerton Holmes, a detectress who would solve crimes. And she wrote them and starred in them.
Is detectress just a female detective?
Well,
Did they
yes.
switch it up?
In the
That's
olden
not real,
days,
right?
no, in the olden days, you called women writers authoresses. And I know it's ridiculous, but yeah, she put herself down as detectress, and I think it was supposed to be funny.
I also kept seeing the word scenario next to her name.
Yes, a scenario is really a script. The fact is that I've got her silent film scripts that she wrote, some of them by hand, and you could shoot them now. I mean, I know writers sometimes wonder about formatting and why it's important, and they get upset because they have to do scene headings. But the scene head, everything about the format of a screenplay, whether it was written in 1915 or 2022, the formatting tells the production how to schedule, how to budget, how to put everything together in the production. So you could take her scripts right now and shoot them. Yes, I mean, a lot. The action is overwritten, and sometimes the dialogue is a little bit not as natural as we do now. But the formatting is the same. It's amazing.
Are her original writing under glass? Where do you keep them?
Oh, no, probably. I will probably donate them to the Academy, because she was one of the original 36 founders of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences, and they have asked for her papers. But, the reality is, in those days, people didn't save what they do now. I mean, my grandfather and my grandmother, when they finished with a project, that was it. That was gone.
Right.
I have maybe 4 or 5 boxes of her stuff. That's it for her whole career.
One of the showrunners that I've worked for, the amazing John Worth, he keeps, or at least he used to, he keeps every draft of every script, and then they're all put in binders for every episode. And one day, as I was putting the binders up on a shelf for him, he said something like, "Yeah, I need to get those home so I can put them in a box so my kids can throw them away when I die," which I thought was so funny.
But you know what? I because most of my career has been in development, motion picture development, but screenplay development. I got in the habit of keeping every single draft of the script that we would do for our productions, and that has come in incredibly handy when there's a question of credit. If there are multiple writers on a screenplay,
oh yeah,
who gets the Writers Guild credit makes a huge difference, because that means residuals and all sorts of things. And I had one project that was many years in development. We had 63 different drafts of the script, and we kept all of them until the credit thing was determined. But if you don't, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, keep your
Yes,
drafts.
all writers, make sure you keep all the drafts of your scripts.
Yes.
Just put them in a folder on your desktop or somewhere like
Yes,
that,
it's
but keep
much easier nowadays.
all your drafts. Yes.
Okay. And it was, I believe, around 1914 that Bess married Wilfred
Wilfred,
Lucas.
yes.
He was
Mhm.
also an actor.
He was an actor, yes. He's in some of the Laurel and Hardy movies. He plays the dean in A Chump Goes to Oxford, which is
Oh,
hysterical because he died way before I was born, and I'd never heard his voice until I saw
oh,
the movie. So
that's
that was
just
really interesting.
that's really sweet. Bess, and after they got married, I think this is a production company, part of Universal. They started Universal Manufacturing Company.
Yes, they
Okay.
they they were, it was such a Wild West time back then. You could do just about anything you wanted, and they started a production company. She directed, co-directed a lot of things, directed some of them, and they actually went to Australia, one of the very first Hollywood productions to go to Australia and do 2 feature films there. When my father was an infant, she just packed him up with the equipment and took him to Australia.
You're not kidding when you say packed up with the equipment because they sailed to Australia
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This took forever.
with an infant.
Yeah, right.
This is a
Yeah.
brave woman. This is a brave,
Oh,
brave
she
woman.
was she was fearless, absolutely fearless.
Loved, they kind of, when they first got there, was working with a stuntman, and I loved his name, Reg
Oh,
Snowy Baker.
Snowy Baker is a legend in Australia. If you go to Australia and mention Snowy Baker, even now, everybody knows him.
Oh, I
He was a
didn't know
legend.
that.
So it was a big deal. It was like coming here and, working with one of the top actors in the business. I mean, it was a big deal for them to. I mean, I think Snowy Baker thought he was doing them a favor. So, I mean, it all worked out, and
Yeah.
and the films worked really well.
And Bess was able to really spread her wings. There was nobody to say, no, you can't direct. No, you can't edit. And she ended
Yeah.
up basically editing and titling her own films.
Yep, she did. She did it all, literally all. When I was a kid, we still had her moviola, which people nowadays would faint. But the old days, they had the negative, and you'd run the negative from reel to reel, and actually cut the negative to make the cuts. And she showed us how to do that. My sister and I, how to do that. So, yeah, she did it all.
That's quite a skill. And cutting negative would scare me to
Oh,
death. It
yes.
really would. Then after about 1921, they returned to Hollywood, and the list of studios that she worked at, I mean, it's amazing. MGM, Warner Brothers, Goldwyn, First National Pictures, which did they turn into something first?
They turned into something, and I am blanking on who they turned into, but
Okay.
I think that was Shanks. But
Shanks.
I don't, you know what, frankly, I don't remember.
Yeah, it's okay. And Columbia Pictures. And by now, Bess just had this stellar reputation in Hollywood of especially handling difficult personalities. And MGM sent her to rescue Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur was shooting in Italy, and it was over budget and over schedule. The dailies that were coming that they saw, which of course took forever because it wasn't like nowadays where you push a button and you get the dailies, they weren't happy with it. So they sent her over. So she did an entire rewrite of the script, but more than that, she was the production manager on the script. And that's one of my favorite stories of her. This is the silent version with Ramon Navarro and Francis Lederer, I think. There's the chariot race, but before the chariot race, there's a naval battle, and in the naval battle, the rumor got started that an extra was drowned, which turned out not to be true at all. But Mussolini, who was the mayor of Rome at the time, he had felt politically he had to sort of step in, and he wanted to confiscate the negative. Well, that was not about to happen with my grandmother.
Mhm.
She put the reels of negative in her hat boxes, got on a train, and went from Rome to Paris, where she delivered the hand boxes to the lab for processing. So she saved the negative in that case.
Mind blown. That is amazing. Where's that movie?
Yeah, right. She'd make an interesting character for a movie, I must say.
Yes.
She was as well known for working. In those days, women weren't relegated to writing only for women, although she did. She wrote for Greta Garbo, and she wrote for Joan Crawford, the young Joan Crawford, but she also wrote for John Barrymore. She wrote 3 movies for him. He became a very close, lifelong friend. She wrote The Mark of Zorro with Tyrone Power. So, they weren't pigeonholed. That was one of the wonderful things that happened in the early days. And I think it's actually coming back, the pendulum swinging back, and writers aren't being pigeonholed as much as they used to be. I hope.
Yes. With all the new places where you can watch film and TV.
Well, all the places you can sell your projects, There are enormous numbers of places that are now purchasing, material. Streaming companies, you can do webisodes, you can do all sorts of things that they didn't have back in the studio system, but they did have back in the days of my grandmother. So I think it is swinging to a more inclusive, more robust kind of opportunity for everybody.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah,
now,
it was.
Speaking of credits, she on Ben-Hur, I know they were kind of loose and fast with credits back then.
Yes, it was
And
not nearly.
she was listed as continuity.
Yeah, but she did
so much more.
Well, everybody knew it. She knew it. The people who hired her knew it. So it didn't matter so much that the public knew it, because there weren't anything like residuals. Nowadays, you want the credit because you want, if you're a writer, you want the WGA residuals. And back then, they didn't have those.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one thing for the union.
Yes. I mean, also, you mentioned Greta Garbo. I know that these dates, and you'll have to correct me, I found a couple of different dates, but I'm going to go with in 1928, Bess was nominated.
It was 28. She got nominated twice for her writing. And I think both of them might have been the Greta Garbo. Oh, no, one of them was Joan Crawford, but Greta Garbo, Woman of Affairs. Woman of Affairs. Now, this is before the code came in, so they were able to be a little more. Yes, they had to tone down the story. The story's very. There's a lot of kind of, I don't want to say risque, but a little bit controversial aspects to the book, but they toned them down, but not too much, and people really enjoyed those kinds of not melodramatic, but very dramatic movies. And Woman of Affairs was definitely that.
And it was based on the book, The Green Hat.
The Green Hat, yes.
Yes. In 1930s, unfortunately, the heart of MGM, Irving Thalberg, who was a huge fan and supporter.
He was a fan of writers in general, women writers in particular, and Bess and her good friend Frances Marion really in particular. He was one of those producers, studio executives that writers love to work with, because even though they are very pragmatic and they know what kind of material they want, they're supportive of writers. And you don't always find that at the studio. No. With Irving Thalberg, they did. And when Thalberg died, it really sort of spelled the end or the diminution of women screenwriters in general. And I think, smarter people than I think, that as money started pouring in, big money, then the men started pushing everybody else out, the women and everybody. Back in the silent era, there were a lot, many more than we think, a lot of African American silent films, production companies. There are a lot of that. We just they didn't get shown it to the general public, so they didn't
Right.
last. But it was a much more inclusive time, but as big money came in, it started to get more of a boys' club.
Also, the story department at MGM was one of the best of all the studios. It was very,
Yes,
very, very competitive at that studio.
it was. It was. I worked at MGM in my career, and loved walking past where my grandmother had worked. They called where the writers' building was, they called it the writers' block, which I liked.
Oh, I'm so happy for you that you got to be where she
Oh,
went to work.
I worked at Warner Brothers, and I worked on the very stages, because my grandfather did most of his work at Warner Brothers. I worked on the stages that he worked on, and my mother worked on. I had her diaries. She passed away very, very young, and I have some of her diaries, and I'd be reading, worked on stage 24 today, and I was working on stage 24 today. I mean, it was like so amazing. So I got to see where my parents met and fell in love, and my grandparents met and fell in love. But my grandmother, after they sort of got pushed to the side,
it makes me sad.
she'd married by that time. She'd married Mike Curtez,
Right.
and his star was going way up, and her star was fading. But she always worked on his script. She worked on my father's scripts too. But
I bet.
She worked on his every script. It was an open secret in Hollywood that he'd come in with story notes, and everybody would know that they were Bess's story notes, and that included Casablanca.
Yes.
The famous stories about how unfinished the script was. That's not exactly true. They always knew how it was going to end, but not exactly the scene where it was going to end. But when you think about Casablanca, the movie was made in 1942. And the war was raging, and America was not doing well. The Nazis in North Africa, which is where Casablanca is located, the real Casablanca, were overrunning the country. Nobody knew how the war was going to end. So when they were developing the script as they were shooting it, they kept putting in more bits about patriotism and sacrifice and bravery and things like that. So that was a lot of what was going on.
I actually have the quote from Julius Epstein, who said, when we had a story conference and Mike came in the next day and made criticisms or suggestions, we knew that they were Bess Meredyth's ideas, not his. So it was easy to trip him up. We'd make a change and say, what do you think, Mike? And he'd have to go back and ask Bess.
Yes. And of course, he had a very strong accent, not as strong as people pretend it to be, but he mangled English pretty well. And he would always say, no, wait, I forget what Bess tells me. And he'd have to go out and call her. He didn't try to hide it, really. Everybody knew. Well, she was quite a resource to have in his pocket, because she was really good with story, very good with story.
Besides the simple fact of time gone by, and why don't we know more about people like your grandmother and Frances Marin? And do you think there's any correlation between what was happening then and what's happening now? We kind of touched on it a little earlier.
I do. I really do. I was thinking about this. I think that writers today have many, many more opportunities than they did 10 years ago, certainly more than 20 years ago, because of all of the different venues, product. Everybody needs product. And television, features, shorts. If you had said 20 years ago that a short film could make its money back, people would have laughed. Nowadays, short films are something that can be monetized. So writers, I always encourage aspiring writers, just get your feet wet. If you don't feel like you can write the feature film first, write a short.
Yes.
Now, not to say it's easier, but it's something that is more manageable. Keep writing, because that's what these women did. And another thing about women in early Hollywood was they were very supportive of one another. You read it all the time, and I certainly know from my grandmother and Frances and Maggie Ettinger and June Mathis and all of the women that they were close to. They all supported one another. Of course, there was some rivalry, you got to sign that thing. I really wanted that thing. But in the big picture, they supported one another as opposed to competed with one another. And I think I see that. I absolutely do see that now. Another thing that I find similar in the olden days to now is that the lines are blurring. In the old days, if I was on a set and I could see that they needed a mag of film or something up at the camera, I wasn't allowed to pick it up and move it to the camera. No, that was somebody's job.
Correct.
Nowadays, and I don't want to say taking somebody's job away, but now the lines are a little bit blurring. You can make an actual wonderful movie with a crew of 12. Mm-hmm. You don't have to have huge camera equipment and lights and things like that. Promising Young Woman, that film 2 years ago,
correct,
was made, I think, in 16 days.
Oh my
16
goodness!
Days, and not for a whole bunch of money. Coda, which is one of my favorite films of the year, is a tiny little movie. Apple TV financed it. The interesting thing about streaming companies, for the writers in the listening to this, is that the streaming companies don't have to analyze every single project and say this will make money and this won't make money, because they don't have to raise the money for that particular project. They get their money through subscriptions and they decide where to put it. So if they finance something that may be a niche thing but might break out, they can do that, where it's much harder for independent producers like me or studios who now want to do the big tentpole movies and don't really want to acquire those little movies as opposed to produce them. Right. So I think I think it's not Wild West time, but I think there is a great opportunity for writers nowadays that hasn't been there for a long time.
Yes. Thank you for that. And thank you for saying, be supportive. And right. It's
you need
pillars.
I grew up in a house. I was not lucky enough to be kissed by the angel to be a good writer myself. My talent lies in terms of development and working with writers and things like that. But I grew up in a house where writing, that was the job. That was what people did. And I know what it takes to write a script. I know the blood, sweat, and tears, and seat time, and agony, and despair, yes, and euphoria, and all of that comes from sitting down and writing. And that doesn't change whether you're writing in the 1920s or the 2020s.
What's your favorite memory of your grandmother?
Oh, her stories. We all lived together, which was really nice. So after school, my sister and I would run upstairs where she would, be holding court in her rooms. Oh. And we would beg her to tell us stories of her early days and the adventures that they had making movies. They didn't have stunt people back then. The actors just did the stunts. And she used to tell one story we loved was she was acting in this, somebody in a wheelchair, and the bad guy pushes her off a dock into the ocean. And of course she had to do it, and landed in a school of jellyfish. Had to sort of swim out, and they couldn't do take two because she was covered with welts. So anyway, great fun. She had some fabulous stories.
That is wonderful. You were also a fan of her jewelry box. Why?
But that was that connected with it, because every piece of jewelry had a story connected to it. I wore this brooch when I went to San Simeon with Hearst and Marion Davies. I wore this to the Academy Awards. This was given to me.
Oh, how lovely.
One of my absolute favorites is a brooch made of tiger claws that the Maharaja of Jaipur gave her not for services rendered, but because he was enchanted with her, which a lot of people were. She was a absolute spitfire, and everybody seemed to like her. She was tiny, really a tiny person, red hair, vivacious as anything, and so each piece
She's gorgeous
sort of told
inside and out.
She was.
Yeah. I'm going to put her pictures up on our IG page for the Writers Hangout podcast.
Oh, okay.
She's just, our audience will get to see her. She's just so beautiful. We've talked about her friends. Did you have a favorite? Did you have a favorite friend who was nice to you?
Frances Marion was, we called her Aunt Fran. And she was probably my grandmother's closest friend. And she was one of those people who talked to kids like people. None of this, what grade are you in? What's your favorite subject? None of that. She was an absolutely astounding person. And the thing that I loved best about Aunt Fran was that her presents were always things that I didn't know I wanted. But the minute I got them, I knew. She was so insightful. Well, she gave me oil paints one time. And another time she gave me a book on African conservation and stories about animals. She was just, she knew, she just almost had a sixth sense about what your interests were, what your talents were. And she went right in on that.
And it sounds like she was also trying to expand the world for you.
Well, very much so. When you're a kid in Hollywood, and we had a very quiet life compared to a lot of kids, but you get a lot of presents at Christmas from people who want your folks to give them jobs.
Yes.
And so we would have mounds of presents under the tree. None of them were interesting, except Aunt Fran's.
Oh, that's so wonderful. It was by the late 50s, your grandmother, she really started to tuck herself away from the world, but she always made time for you guys.
Yes, she did.
How did that make you feel? What was that like?
Well, these olden days where mental health was something that you didn't talk about, looking back on it, that was just her. And because I grew up with it, it didn't mean an awful lot to me. But looking back on it, I'm positive she had clinical depression.
Yeah.
But nobody knew that. Nobody, it wasn't like nobody cared, but it just wasn't something that was dealt with. Yeah. So I wish I could go back and sort of say, excuse me, maybe some Zoloft would help, or, whatever. But I can't. I think she really did love us. Well, I know she did, but I think we did brighten her day, and she loved telling the stories. So that was,
I'm
great.
Sure you did. My last question for you. Now, I hesitated, but I really do want to know the answer to this. What do you think your grandmother would have thought about this year's Academy Awards when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock? First of all, did you watch it?
Of course I watched. I always watch it. First of all, I think my grandmother would have been so excited to see the women in positions of writing and directing and getting the awards.
Oh, excuse me for interrupting, but did you see Jane Champion give Kevin Costner a note? He introduced her, and then she goes, "That was rather dramatic."
She's wonderful. She's typical New Zealander, just sort of straight shooting.
Yeah, sorry, but I interrupted you, but go back to your grandmother.
I think my grandmother probably would have beaten Smith up, or maybe she would have tackled him to keep him from going. But I don't think she would have been quiet. Let's put it that way. She would not have been quiet. However, I do have to say, I get his thing about protecting people, although it's a little bit paternalistic, but still, okay, I
Right.
get that. But you know who I really respect in terms of protecting people was Lady Gaga and Liza Minnelli. I think her clear not compassion, she cared.
Yes.
She wanted to, she helped Liza. You could see that Liza was struggling, and Gaga was there, I got you. And her looking up, and Minnelli looking up and saying, I know you do. I mean, it just broke my heart. But
If Gaga
that's the kind of preparing.
Yeah, if Gaga
Protecting.
If Gaga hadn't done what she did, I mean, I don't think she meant for the world to hear her whisper to Liza. But, a lot of young people don't know who Liza is. I'm not saying it's their fault. They're younger.
No.
But, go watch Cabaret and not bow down to Liza Minnelli.
50 years ago. Cabaret came out 50 years ago.
Exactly.
And it stands up really well. I just watched it. So
yes.
It really does stand up. And Liza Minnelli was a force of nature. She still might be, but she's clearly, I don't know what the situation is, but if she's in a wheelchair, it's got something to do with muscular mobility.
It could have been that maybe people, could have laughed at her struggling, but Lady Gaga was like, nope,
Lady Gaga,
we're not doing that.
Nope. She was there, and that's protecting. That's compassionate protecting. That's not violent protecting. And I don't know, you can argue both sides of that, but I come down in, I'd rather be the Lady Gaga.
Yes. I mean, I am still shocked by what happened. I am still formulating even what I think of the whole thing. It was so shocking.
I thought it was a setup. I mean, when he walked up there, Chris Rock looked like he was going to come up and do a shtick with him.
Right. And I think Chris Rock thought the same thing, because he said, oh, look, Richard, like King Richard is coming for me. Yeah. There's already conspiracy theories all over the internet. And there's photos saying Chris Rock was wearing a pad on his cheek. So
I don't.
That's crazy. Oh, well, yes.
I can't. I don't think so.
I don't think so. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about your grandmother. And I hope everybody goes out there and just looks your grandmother up and does a little research on their own and watches her movies. I personally am going to see The Woman of Affairs. I am finding that movie and I am watching it. It looks really good. And is there any last thoughts you'd like to share with us about?
Just to know that for people who want to make a career out of writing for films, that it's not easy, and I don't want to pretend it's easy, but I think this is another golden era for writers. I think this is going to be a time where writers can really come to the fore and expand what they do and how many people get to do it. It's not going to be a little tiny closed club. People are going to be able to do it. Now, maybe you're not going to get totally rich, but you're going to get your material, you're going to get your movies out there, you're going to get seen, you're going to get your creative images on the screen. And that's what's so important.
Victoria, what a wonderful way to end the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. This was great fun.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's a wrap for the Writers Hangout. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, and thrive. Till we get to hang out again, keep writing. The world needs your stories. The Writers Hangout is sponsored by the Page International Screenwriting Awards. Executive producer, Kristin Overn. Producers, Terry Sampson and Sandy Adomaitis. Music by Ethan Stoller.